Hi, my name is Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to my June wrap up. We're going to do it vlog style this month, so as I'm speaking we are about a week into June. It is a Saturday. I had my book club this morning at the library, which was as always delightful. Fortunately we all DNF the book. It's always I always feel slightly trepidatious when I DNF the book club book. I don't know why, because we're a very easygoing group, but it's always sort of quite reassuring when other people have had the same reaction to the book as you. Yeah, we all DNF'd it. It was a book I mentioned in my last wrap up called Falling Sideways by Thomas E. Kennedy. The reason I DNF'd it because it was quite male gazy. Apparently that got even worse the further you got into the book. So DNFing was definitely a good decision. But I had a wonderful morning with some lovely people talking about many things. A little bit of bookish talk, but lots of other talk as well. June has got off to a really great reading month so far. I've actually been reading 5 books at once over the last week. This is highly unusual behaviour for me. I normally read 1 book at a time, maybe 2 at a push. 5 at once, I don't think I've ever done before, but I've been having a great reading month so far. Unusually for me, I did do a little TBR video for June because I want to focus on reading, sort of prioritising some of the queer books on my TBR for Pride Month. And all the books I've been reading so far this month have been queer. I've only actually finished 1, but I'll just run through briefly the ones that I have been reading. And further thoughts on these will follow later on in the video once I have finished these books. So I have been rereading The Paying Guests by Sarah Waters. This is a buddy read with Tiffany from Towering TBR. This is wonderful. I love it very much. This is set in 1920s London, following a young woman and her mother just after the First World War, and they are struggling financially, so they take in a pair of lodgers. I'm about probably 3/4 of the way through this, very much enjoying it. I've been reading some non-fiction as well. Outrageous by Paul Baker. This is a story of Section 28 and Britain's battle for LGBT education. I'm probably about 2/3 of the way through this. This is very, very interesting, very informative. Further thoughts will follow shortly. I've had some short stories on the go. This is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. Really enjoying this. The stories are sort of deliciously weird, quite feminist. There was one story that I have skipped, I will say, which was called Especially Heinous. It was quite a long short story. It's about 60 pages and I don't really understand it. It was, what's the show? Law and Order. It was like a paragraph on each of 272 episodes of Law and Order, which I've never seen. I'm assuming this is kind of fictionalised, and I think there is a through narrative, but I read a few pages of that and just didn't get it. But the other stories so far, very much enjoying. I do have an ebook on the go, which it might be a DNF. I haven't totally decided. I'm going to give it maybe another week or so and see how I get on. It's The Late Americans by Brandon Taylor, which I have on NetGalley. And I really, really like Real Life by this author, which was Booker shortlisted a few years ago. But I'm not quite getting on with The Late Americans. I don't know how much of that is the fact that I'm reading it electronically, which is not really my preference for reading. And I don't pick up sort of the tablet to read that often. So because I'm not picking up the book for sort of like quite long stretches of time, I'm just not really into the story. So anyway, that might be a DNF, but I'll let you know. But the book I have finished this week is The Black Flamingo by Atta. This was a wonderful, wonderful book. So I think it's sort of shelved as YA, but I'd recommend it for, anyone really. It was really quite a joyful book, looking at some challenging issues. So we follow Michael, and it's a coming of age story. So the book starts when Michael is about 6 years old. Michael is black, biracial and gay, and he asks his mother for his 6th birthday for a Barbie doll. And on the day he's disappointed when he receives a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle along with a matching birthday cake. And he asks his mother why she didn't get him a Barbie doll, and she had just assumed he was joking. His mother is quite supportive of Michael as the book goes on, but is somewhat concerned about, I guess, society's expectation and how he might be treated and his safety and so on. So anyway, as I say, it's a coming of age story, and Michael goes to university, and it's largely about him finding where he belongs and understanding his own identity. So there was a line in here that I was going to read. Here it is. So when he joins university, he sort of joins various societies to try and, meet people, find his group of people, if you like. And he says, I don't feel black enough for African Caribbean society. I didn't feel Greek enough for Hellenic society. I didn't feel queer enough for LGBT society, but I've got to find a group that's just right for me. And he discovers the drag society, and that's where he comes up with his drag persona of the Black Flamingo. And the novel is told in verse, so although it looks like a reasonable length, like 350 odd pages, because it's told in verse, there's not sort of that many words on the page. We get sort of like little pictures as well. And the character of Michael is a poet as well, so writes poetry. So the book is interspersed with poems that he's written, and then as his sort of drag alter ego, the Black Flamingo, he performs poetry as well, which we get in the book. It's a really sort of a joyful story, actually, and I would highly, highly recommend it. Hello again, it's now a week later and I have finished 4 books. First is The Paying Guest by Sarah Waters. I, as anticipated, thoroughly enjoyed rereading this. I was rereading this with Tiffany from Towering TBR, whose channel I'll link down below. I will say this is probably my 5th favourite Sarah Waters book out of her 6 novels, but I still absolutely loved it and gave it 4.5 stars. So I think I mentioned earlier in the video, it's set in 1920s London, just after the First World War, and we follow Frances and her mother, who due to their personal circumstances need to take in lodgers. So this young couple come to stay with them, whose name I have forgotten, Lillian and Leonard. So they move in. About halfway through the book, there is something happens, and it sort of veers into crime mystery territory. We have some courtroom scenes. The second part of the book is super pacey. As with all of Sarah Waters' novels, in my opinion, it's very, very well written with great characters. There is, of course, some queerness in here as well. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I also finished reading Outrageous by Paul Baker. So this is non-fiction, and this is about Section 28, which came into force in 1988 in the UK, and it prohibited the promotion of homosexuality in schools, and it prohibited homosexuality as a, in quotes, pretended family relationship. So this goes into the history, the backdrop of things that led up to that coming into force. There was a lot of, I mean, the whole thing was ridiculous anyway, of course, but there was a lot of ridiculous debate about sort of semantics. None of the politicians involved really seemed to agree on exactly what it was they meant by what was put into the wording of the clause, which became the section. There is a lot in the book around from both parts. So the people who were in agreement with Section 28, who wanted it to come into force, and the sort of groundswell of those people who were against it, both queer and straight, and the protests that took place. The book also looks at how Section 28 then came to be repealed. It wasn't repealed in England until I think it was 2004. It was repealed earlier in Scotland. and the book looks at the legacy as well of Section 28. So Paul Baker himself was 16 at the point that Section 28 came into force. So it does touch on sort of some of his personal experience, but it's really, there is a lot about politics. It is told in a very engaging way and accessible way, and with some bits of humour sort of sprinkled throughout. The one thing that I was maybe expecting that wasn't in there, and maybe that's just down to me having wrong expectations of the book, was that I was expecting there to be more sort of testimonies from teachers, from pupils and parents from the time, and sort of examples of what was going on and what it meant to be in a school at that time, and that I think was lacking a little bit. Again, that's probably just my expectations being wrong. I was at school pretty much like the whole time that Section 28 was in force, so it was interesting to me because as I suspect most pupils at the time were, certainly younger ones, were completely oblivious to Section 28 being in force at the time, so didn't know what it meant for them, didn't understand what had changed within the school system because of the politics at the time, and didn't realise that there was anything lacking there, I guess. So anyway, overall I really, really enjoyed it. I'd be interested to read more by Paul Baker. I think he's got another couple of non-fictions as well that I would be keen to pick up at some point. And then the next book I read, surprisingly, is the choice for my next month's library book club. So we only met last weekend, and I actually started this book the same day that we had last month's meeting. Very unusual. We only meet once a month, so we're not meeting for another 3 weeks, and ordinarily I try to save the book club book until like the week before, so it's fresh in my mind, if indeed I manage to get to the end of it. And so the book was Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. This is a book that I have read before. I read it when it was first published, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I think two or three of us in the group have read this before, separately, away from the group. But as I've mentioned, I think we are somewhat restricted in what books we have to choose from for book club at the library, and so we went for what is a reread for some of us, and I anticipate that those of us who are new to this book, I suspect they will get on with it very well. You probably know what this is about. This was a very sort of big deal a few years ago. So we follow Eleanor Oliphant, who is a young woman living by herself. She lives a fairly isolated life, and she lives a life that is driven by routine. She works in like an accounts office. She goes to do her job every day, comes home, and then at the weekend on a Friday she stops at the supermarket on the way home, buys a pizza and a bottle of wine and 2 bottles of vodka, and that's how she passes the weekend, in this sort of drunken stupor, in order to sort of survive the weekend really, before she then goes back to work on a Monday. The book is told with quite a lot of humour as well. She meets a colleague at work who works in IT, I think, called Raymond, and they sort of strike up this friendship, which is quite lovely and quite funny as well in parts. It's clear from the start of the book that Eleanor has had some kind of tragic past, particularly in relation to her family circumstances. She has weekly calls with her mother, and it's quite clear that they have a very difficult and troubled relationship, and as we go further through the book we find out more about what that entails. The book does touch on some difficult topics, so check out trigger warnings online, but overall it was a really entertaining read, although sad in parts, quite funny, and yeah, I really enjoyed rereading it. Then I read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. Now, this is a book I've had on my shelves for a couple of years now. This is a second-hand copy, and I really, really like this, and it was not at all what I was expecting in a good way. So I was expecting this to be, because Ocean Vuong is a poet, very well written, very lyrical, moving and sentimental, but to be honest, I think I was expecting it to be a little bit dull, just based on how I've heard it described in the past. And I think that's why I have been putting off reading it, because I was concerned I'd probably DNF it. And so some of my expectations were correct. It is very, very well written. Most of it is told in sort of prose format. We do have bits that are told more, shorter bits that are told more in a poetic format. It is quite touching. It's a difficult read in parts. It touches on some really heavy themes, which I actually wasn't expecting, and it has more plot than I was expecting as well. So it's about little dog who is Vietnamese living in the US, and the format of the book is he is writing a letter to his mother, a letter that his mother is not going to ever read because she is illiterate. And there was a quote I wanted to read out. Yeah. So he says, "The very impossibility of your reading this is all that makes my telling it possible." So he recounts his life, his childhood which is blighted by violence, both that he is directly experiencing and also that he has witnessed to. He recounts as he grows older, his relationship. He develops a relationship with another young man called Trevor. They are working together in, what are they doing? Some sort of farm type activity. Anyway, so he develops this relationship with Trevor, who is white American, and how little dog's background and experience of violence and what he not quite comes to expect as normal, because he does recognise it for what it is, but how he comes to sort of expect to be treated, and within his relationships, how that then affects his relationship with Trevor. The book also touches on the opioid crisis in the US, on addiction, and I wasn't expecting any of that actually, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say that either, so I'm surprised that I sort of wasn't aware of any of that going into it really. But anyway, so there's a lot going on in this book, and I really, really liked it. It was difficult to read at parts, I will say, but you can tell that Ocean Vuong is a poet, and not just because of the more sort of poetic sections, but through his prose, really well written and very sort of thought-provoking. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. And then I will mention a book that I have just started today. I am only 30 pages in. This is I Have Some Questions For You by Rebecca Makkai. I can't remember where I first heard about this. It was only published this year. It's described as part boarding school drama, part forensic whodunit. Both things that I quite like. So I will update you on my thoughts once I've finished it. Hello, it's about a week later and I have a few more little updates. We'll do the DNFs first, and then I have some exciting news. So these two DNFs, I don't really know why I picked them up, because I was never really going to like them. The first is The No-Show by Beth O'Leary, not my usual reading matter. I actually won this in a competition. I don't know why I entered the competition, because I knew I probably wasn't going to like it, but I thought I'd give it a go. I made it to page 13 before I decided it was not for me. And then the other book I have DNF'd is The Locked Room by Ellie Griffiths. So Ellie Griffiths is a very, well-established and popular crime writer. I have read, I think, 2 of her books before, and I've generally been quite underwhelmed by them. I picked this one up. I made it to about 50 pages-ish. And, it's okay, but it's just not great. And when I pick up sort of a police procedural like this, I'm not expecting wonderful writing. As long as the writing is serviceable, that's absolutely fine for me. Because for these books, it's all about the plot. But the writing was kind of a little bit bad. Not awful, but just like a little bit bad. So yeah, I DNF that. But exciting news. It's finally happened. I have read my first 5-star book of the year. Eventually, I thought this day would never come. And it is I Have Some Questions For You by Rebecca Makkai. So I went into this book with not really any expectations. I'd heard maybe 1 or 2 people mention it. I hadn't really heard very many reviews. And it sat on my shelf for a couple of weeks. I got it out of the library before actually picking it up and reading it, and I loved it. So I am going to do a individual book review video of it, which will probably be out by the time you see this, so I will link it down below. So this is sort of a mix between a crime novel and literary fiction. We follow a 40-year-old woman called Bodhi, who is a professor of film and podcasting, and she is invited back to the school where she was a pupil to do a short course there for the students. And when Bodhi was a pupil herself in 1995, one of her friends, Thalia, was murdered. Someone was convicted for the crime, but seemingly confessed under duress from the police. There's a lot of online speculation about the fact that the wrong person was imprisoned for the crime. And when Bodhi then goes back to this school to teach this course, she is sort of forced to re-examine what she knew about the case, what she witnessed, her experiences at school. It is a very, very slow-paced book. So if you go into this expecting sort of a typical crime novel, you'll probably be disappointed. It is really an examination of misogyny and racism and online culture. There are so many sort of aspects of Bodhi's time at school that she sort of looks back on and re-examines, both in terms of what it means for the murder of her friend and what might have actually happened, but also just other sort of at the time seemingly incidental small things that would be classed as sexual assault, but at the time were just like insignificant really. So it has that sort of re-examining of things that have happened in the past through a modern lens, through what you now know, to be right or wrong. I thought it was wonderful. I absolutely loved it. I believe this is a bit of a divisive book. I can see why. I imagine a large part of that is because of the slow pace, and because it is very slow paced. The plot does progress, but it is very slow. But I just really enjoyed where we were sitting in the sort of the slower parts of the book and the things that were being examined and discussed. And yeah, I absolutely loved it, so I would highly recommend. Hello again. I've read one more book. I have a DNF. I'm actually on leave this week. I can't remember if I have already mentioned that or not. So I have had much more time for reading, which has been lovely. So the next book I finished was The Wintringham Mystery by Anthony Berkeley. I have done an individual book review of this, which I'll link down below. This is a golden age mystery novel, which was first published in serialised form, where the readers were invited to try and guess the solution to the mystery. And the mystery is that a seance takes place at this country house, and one of the guests disappears during the seance. So the reader is invited to try and solve the mystery of what happened to this guest, where did she go, and who caused the disappearance. The book is well known as Agatha Christie herself entered that competition and actually failed to guess the solution correctly, although she did win one of the £5 consolation prizes. I really enjoyed this. Check out my book review of this if you want to hear my full thoughts. And then I have a surprising DNF. This is a book that I was expecting to like, and I really did not. It's Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone by Benjamin Stevenson. So, the book gets off to a good start because at the very start it includes the sort of the rules of crime fiction, which were first written in 1929 by Ronald Knox, and it talks about it's sort of like the fair play rules that Golden Age crime fiction sort of followed. And I love Golden Age crime fiction. I mean, this is set in the present day, and we have a family who are gathering, and, you know, there's secrets and different things. The narrator, one of the members of the family, speaks directly to the reader, so breaks the fourth wall and makes these sort of wry to camera comments, sort of self-referential, sort of as a, you know, asides for poking fun at the crime genre and different things like that. Anyway, I think there's a fine line between that being funny and it being irritating. I found him pretty irritating. And then the reason I actually DNF'd in the end was because I just thought it was really, really boring. I think I read, how much did I read? I mean, it was at least 50 pages, maybe like 60, 70 pages, I think. I just thought it was really boring. And I think I was hoping that it would have the flavour of Golden Age crime fiction. It doesn't have that flavour at all, I don't think. Although it leans into a couple of the tropes, it doesn't have the feel of it. And so, yeah, sadly, this was not for me. Hi, it's now the end of the month and I have a few more books to wrap up. It's been quite a good reading week, actually. So I finished Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado, which I really enjoyed, apart from that one story which I skipped. I did go back and try it again. It's called Especially Heinous. It's the one which is like sort of describing every episode of Law and Order. I imagine like not the real episodes of Law and Order, which I've never seen. But anyway, I gave it another go because I read an article which compared I Have Some Questions For You by Rebecca Makkai with this short story, Especially Heinous. So I thought I'd go back and give it another go. I still didn't get it. It's probably me because I really enjoyed all the other stories in the collection. Then I had a reread. I read Carol by Patricia Highsmith. So I first read this several years ago now, and I enjoyed the reread, but probably not as much as I enjoyed it on the first read. So the main character is Therese, who is working as a sales assistant in a department store in New York over Christmas time, and she meets this customer called Carol, who comes in to the store to buy, I think, like a doll for her daughter, and they sort of strike up a relationship. So Carol is married to a man, and Therese has a kind of a boyfriend, but they strike up a relationship. Carol is a fair bit older than Therese, and although Carol is obviously, you know, who the book is named after, it was originally titled The Price of Salt, but although Carol is who the book is now named after, I'd say it's more of a story about Therese and her sort of coming of age. The relationship between the two of them is quite interesting. Carol comes across as quite a cold character and not entirely likeable, really, which is fine. I don't have to like all my characters, but the relationship between them, I think, is quite interesting. There was a section of the book which I had completely forgotten about, which is about sort of 2/3 of the way through, which is really quite action packed, and that kind of lost me a bit. I found that dragged a bit. That was a bit dull, but overall it was a decent read, and I'm glad that I reread it. Then I picked up The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. Oh, I loved this book. This was so good. So this is my third time reading Paul Tremblay, and this is absolutely my favourite that I've read so far. So we have quite an isolated setting in this one. So we have a married couple. What are their names? Eric and Andrew, who are on vacation in this cabin in New Hampshire in the middle of nowhere with their daughter Wen. And Wen is playing outside, and this man approaches her and says that her fathers need to let him into the cabin, and his friends who are going to arrive, and she needs to help convince her fathers to let these people into the cabin. So 3 other people arrive. So there's 4 strangers in total who are adamant that they need to speak to Eric and Andrew. And what can I say about the plot? So Eric and Andrew are given this choice by these strangers who have been sent there, and the choice that they have to make basically could involve the end of the world. I found this so gripping, so tense right from the very start. I just absolutely loved it. I really like books that are set in one location over quite a short period of time, and this is what this is. I just thought it was really, really, just really great. I can't really say any more about the plot, can I? It has been made into a film fairly recently by M. Night Shyamalan called Knock at the Cabin. From what I've read, it sounds like that's quite different to the book. But this was just a really, really pacey, great horror read. It's excellent. And then I finished the month off with Rubyfruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown. So I wasn't sure if I would have time to get to this month, but I flew through this one as well. So this is the coming of age story of Molly, who is described on the back of the book as a badass rebel. So the book opens, I think, when she's about sort of 7 years old, living with her family, and she comes to realise very early on that she's gay, and she's a very sort of forthright character. She is very straight talking. She doesn't take any nonsense. She is not ashamed of who she is. I should say it's set in the 70s. Was it first published in the 70s? The book was first published in the early 70s. And we see how sort of some of Molly's family members and people that she encounters sort of don't quite know what to make of her. She is quite rebellious. There is 1 or 2 sort of small parts of this book which were quite weird and not in a good way. It was like, why is that in here? But that aside, it was great. It was just, Molly's such an interesting character, I think, and we see her as she sort of like tries to get away from her hometown, tries to make her name, and it's also quite funny in parts as well. I just thought it was a really, really enjoyable read, and one that I would recommend. So that was a pretty good reading month all in all, I think, for me. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, and let me know what you have been reading as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye.